Hello, my name is Rusty Capps. I'm the president and one of the founding partners of Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners, LLC. In this video, I'll be talking with you about our company, about our instructors, and I'll give you a condensed overview of one of our 4-hour training modules to help you understand what our training looks like. First, about our company. Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. Since 2009, our CTCI instructors have trained thousands of U.S. intelligence community, military, and law enforcement professionals in a wide range of both strategic and tactical counterterrorism and intelligence topics. Initially, our more than 40 off-the-shelf modules were delivered exclusively in person to our public and private sector customers. After the arrival of COVID, however, we began delivering those same classes on the internet. Next, I'd like to talk to you about our instructors. To teach with us here at Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners, you have to have practical field experience in the professions that we teach. All of our instructors are intelligence, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, or law enforcement veterans who have more than 200 years of cumulative professional experience. Now let me introduce the crown jewels of CTCI Training Partners, our very talented instructor. The first instructor I'd like to talk to you about is Connie Huff. Ms. Huff is a retired U.S. Army intelligence officer who worked on counter-espionage investigations for more than 25 years. She's a graduate of the FBI National Academy and was the senior counterintelligence investigator on an espionage case that convicted an Army soldier of spying for Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. For her role in that espionage case, she was named the Department of Defense Investigator of the Year in 1992. Ms. Huff was later assigned as a senior instructor at the U.S. Army's Advanced Counterintelligence Training Course, where she trained Department of Defense military and civilian special agents in advanced counterintelligence skills. Our next instructor is Gina Bennett. Ms. Bennett is a retired CIA counterterrorism specialist and member of the Senior Analytics Service who served 34 years in the intelligence community. She authored the first warnings in the early 1990s about the growing danger from Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Ms. Bennett is currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies and the director of a summer program on intelligence and national security at Georgetown. Our next instructor is Cindy Storr. Ms. Storr was an all-source analyst at the CIA from 1986 to 2007 and was promoted into the Senior Analytical Service in the CIA. Ms. Storr was part of a team that developed and taught the CIA's first terrorism analysis course. She is currently a consultant to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Our next instructor is Daniel J. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney is a retired senior officer in the security service of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who worked several major espionage cases against intelligence officers from the KGB and Eastern European intelligence services. After his retirement from the RCMP, Mr. Mulvaney was the chief of corporate security for 2 Global 500 international oil companies. For the next 18 years, he managed a diverse multinational staff of security managers, investigators, analysts, and technical specialists who provided security and operational support to employees and senior managers who worked and traveled in high-risk international environments. And I am the last of our instructors. From 1965 to 1974, I was an infantry officer. I served in Germany, Korea, and a tour in combat in Vietnam. In 1995, I retired from the FBI as a supervisory special agent after 21 years of service. During that time, I worked a variety of major criminal counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. In 1984, I managed the Anti-Terrorist Operations Center for the Los Angeles Olympic Games. I currently teach our counterterrorism and intelligence modules to professionals at a major U.S. intelligence community agency and am a lecturer at Georgetown University in a summer program on intelligence and national security. And now, it's time to give you a first-hand look, as I promised earlier, at our innovative training. To do that, I'm going to take you through an abbreviated running of one of our 4-hour modules. We're now going to look at an overview of a module that's called Practical Perspectives on Counterterrorism Operations. It was delivered first in 2007, sponsored by DOE at a facility in the Baltimore-Washington Airport area in a 5-day, 40-hour format. We've since been asked by our clients to reduce the length of the modules to either 4 or 8 hours. The course itself is an intensive, non-linear overview of the strategy, tactics, definitions, patterns, and the lessons learned from the study of the tactics of terrorist groups. We've designed it to place into perspective the evolution of terror from ancient times to the modern era, looking at groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the recent attack by Hamas on October the 7th, 2023. It will provide attendees with practical knowledge that they need and the skills to recognize intelligence collection operations that are run by terrorist groups, the pre-incident indicators of attacks by terrorist groups, and also will discuss appropriate countermeasures to these types of threats. Now, the course has been delivered scores of times to literally thousands of employees in the federal government, in the intelligence community, in law enforcement agencies at the local, the state, and the national level, as well as to our allies and foreign intelligence and counterterrorism services. This slide gives you an indication of some of the agencies and organizations that have attended this particular course in any of its various formats. The first of the modules that we teach in this course is an introduction to terrorism, where we look in detail at the numerous definition of what terrorism is, early terrorism role models, those terrorists that set the stage for the terrorists that we're seeing today, that are studied by the terrorists that we see today. We'll look at the terrorist cycles themselves, typologies of terrorism, and then I'll look at the first terrorist groups, starting really with ancient times, and then going to the French Revolution, then bringing those terrorist groups forward. There are 3 very practical modules on counterterrorism measures, tactics to use against terrorist groups that we teach. The first is Generation 1. Generation 1 terrorist countermeasures involves defensive reactions to terrorist attacks, preparation for a potential terrorist attack, the protection of a high-value employee of a company or a senior member of an administration. Includes guns, gates, guards, personal security elements, that's the people that actually man the security detail, and then armoring up the vehicles that the protectee travels in, or the facility that you're looking to protect with the guns, gates, and guards. Generation 2 focuses on the target and makes the target more resilient to attacks by the terrorist by looking at a number of different routines that the target is involved in. We'll look at movement and terrain analysis of the target to determine what sort of routines that the target is involved in that can be exploited by the terrorist group. We'll look at attack recognition, and we'll look at surveillance detection, how to recognize that you're being surveilled, because every terrorist attack begins first with a surveillance of the target, an intelligence collection attack. And then Generation 3 is the application of counterintelligence tradecraft to the offensive operations against terrorist groups. And we'll break that down, talk about such things as technologies that are used, talk about recruitment, talk about surveillances, the various types of surveillances that we use against terrorist groups. The next of the modules is personal security for the international travel and expatriate. What we start out with in this particular module is looking at the relationship between criminal and terrorist attacks. 90% of all attacks against Americans, actually against travelers worldwide, are criminal attacks. And so it's important to keep that into perspective as you're looking at how to prepare yourself for safe foreign travel. It's not terrorists that are the biggest problem that you have to consider. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're an American, you're a target wherever you are. So you want to make sure you're not wearing clothing, hats that identify you readily as an American. And a big part of this particular module is recognizing how important it is for the bad guys to collect intelligence on you, to surveil you before the attack comes, which gives you an opportunity to recognize that an attack is in progress if you're able to know what are the indicators that you're under surveillance and then do something about it. We teach another module called America Under Assault, looking at how the United States is targeted by international terrorist movements or groups inside the United States, either sponsoring and motivating people to carry out these attacks or actually sending cells of terrorists to the United States to carry out the attack themselves, as in the first bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, and then 9/11 itself and other bombings that have taken place. We go back to the latter part of the 19th century, the 1880s, and look at anarchist attacks in the United States, terrorism that was carried out by anarchist groups, and then bring the camera forward looking at groups and individuals who've conducted terrorist attacks inside the continental United States since that particular time. The next of our modules is called The Anatomy of a Terrorist Attack. This gets inside a specific terrorist attack to see the difficulties they encounter to be able to commit terrorism. We use as a model the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center and look at the plumbing of terrorism, the financing of terrorism, the communication of terrorism, the requirement to have safe houses and places to build your bomb, and the rental of cars and vehicles to carry the weapon or the terrorist to the target. This is a 4-hour block of instructions that look specifically inside a terrorist attack to give you a sense of how challenging it is for them to be successful in their operations. In this particular module, we call it Connecting the Dots on the Al-Qaeda attack on 9/11 and then the life of Osama bin Laden. We look at the specific intelligence that was available ahead of the September the 11th, 2001 attacks, that if it had been analyzed and come together in a what's going wrong center somewhere, we would have been able to recognize and probably disrupt at least portions of that particular attack. At this point, there are about 29 different pieces of intelligence that we have found in the public sector. Now, this is not from government classified information, but this is in books and articles that have been written about 9/11 that relate to the intelligence that one or more components inside the U.S. or our allied intelligence partners had on the hijackers themselves and the attack that was coming. As a part of that, we dissect Al-Qaeda and we look inside it at its founder, Osama bin Laden, and take him from his birth in one of the most influential non-royal families in Saudi Arabia, the bin Laden family, and the largest construction company in Saudi Arabia, the bin Laden Group, and bring his life forward to Abbottabad when he's killed in 2011 in an attack by American Special Operations Forces. A 4-hour module that looks in detail at the amount of intelligence that was available on 9/11. There's several courses that we teach on domestic terrorism. The first of them looks at right-wing domestic terrorism, and it's an 8-hour-long course, and it looks at the various domestic terrorist groups we deal with today, from the alt-right to the sovereign citizens movement, to the Proud Boys, to the Three Percenters, to the Ku Klux Klan that's still around. And it goes really in an evolutionary format from the earliest domestic terrorist groups to the modern era. The next of our domestic terrorist focuses looks at single-issue terrorist groups. And in this case, we're going to look at left-wing groups, ALF, ELF, and SHAC. These are the Animal Liberation Front, ALF, the Earth Liberation Front, and Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, the groups that focus on a single issue for them, and that is either the protection of animals or the protection of the earth itself. These folks have been around and active since the 1970s, started primarily in Great Britain as opposition to fox hunting, if you can believe that their beginnings were so innocuous. But they are the most prolific terrorists in the world today that you never hear anything about because they don't kill anybody. They're primarily doing damage to facilities, damage to companies. They're trying to free animals. They're trying to stop the forest from being plundered by, in their view, plundered by the logging companies and the paper companies. But they're very, very well educated. They're very, very bright. They're mostly young, in their late teens, and they're very clever about how they operate. They use also a type of terrorism that's very difficult for law enforcement to match up against, and that's leaderless resistance. They don't have a command structure at the top that sends down orders on how to carry out the terrorist attacks. They do it themselves. They plan it, they do the surveillances, they carry out the attacks, and then they disappear. And they're also excellent users of the internet. The anarchist terrorist movement is a 4-hour-long module that starts with the 1880s and the first wave of anarchism and goes to the end of the 1930s when it disappears, and then the second wave starts in the late 1960s and goes to the present day. These are the folks that you'll see most often demonstrating when there's a G7 or a G20 or a World Bank or an International Monetary Fund meeting somewhere in the world. They primarily get involved in demonstrations that often lead to rioting. Beyond that, as you bring the camera forward and looking at Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, it will go beyond just demonstrations to actually punch right-wing groups in the face them down in the demonstrations, and are difficult to identify because they employ black bloc tactics. They dress all in black, cover their faces, and so law enforcement has a difficult time going back, looking at the videos and being able to identify them. They most recently were involved, that is Antifa, in violence at the riots that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. I think it was 2019, over the removal of statues of Civil War heroes, particularly General Robert E. Lee. All right, the next of the modules that I want to discuss with you is the evolution of Middle East terrorist groups and the Israeli-Palestinian animus that was so recently able to capture the attention of the international media and became so violent with the terrorist attacks by Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, out of the Gaza Strip. In this particular module, we go back about 150 years or so and look at the colonial activities in the Middle East that led to the difficulties that we're now dealing with today, primarily by the French and the British as they divided up that part of the world into various zones of influence without taking into account the peoples on the ground, the tribes, the clans, the families, and creating borders that drove right across the normal areas where those indigenous people had been living and been operating and had been controlling certain parts of that part of the world. This particular module will look at how the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the various decisions that the British made when they controlled the Palestinian Mandate before, during, and for 2 or 3 years after World War II, and the United Nations coming up with a plan to resolve the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, the Israelis accepting the plan, Palestinians rejecting it, and the State of Israel standing up in 1948, and the various wars that have been fought between the Israelis and their neighbors since then, including this most recent conflict with Hamas that looks like it may expand into Lebanon and fighting with Hezbollah, is just the latest of numerous wars that have been fought in that part of the world. We do a module on Iranian intelligence services and organizations and how they manage their various surrogate services and terrorist groups and militias around the world, most particularly Hezbollah, but we'll also talk about Iranian proxies in Yemen and Iraq and in Syria. This will look at the various Iranian intelligence services. There's a total of 16 of them that are in place right now, and how they operate against targets around the world and how they cooperate with each other internally. And then finally, we'll end up looking at Hezbollah, what they've done around the world as a terrorist organization and what they've done as a governmental body. They control major portions of Lebanon right now and are very powerful inside the Lebanese governmental system. We also do a module on double agentry, how double agents are used in terrorist operations. We look at the principles of double agentry, the history of double agentry. We define the rules of double agentry and how double agent cases actually are carried out. And then we look at 2 recent double agent cases by terrorist groups targeting us or our allies to see how terrorists have used double agentry in their operations and activities successfully. Everybody knows or has heard about lone wolf terrorism, but few people understand the theory of leaderless resistance that's behind it. So we'll look at that. We'll explain leaderless resistance. We'll talk about where it came from, and we'll look at a number of lone wolf cases to give you an idea of how the practical aspect of leaderless resistance is carried out by terrorists, because all the terrorist groups in the various categories understand the concept and would like to use it more and have used it successfully. There's more than just the lone wolf. There's also another aspect to it that's not often considered, and that is the lone wolf cell, a small group of terrorists that are operating together, but without direction from a larger umbrella movement or organization. We do a 4-hour block on British counterterrorism operations in Northern Ireland because the British intelligence services and the British military were so creative in adapting counterintelligence tools and tradecraft and technologies to counterterror operations. And we go back and look at historically the conflict between the British and the Irish, the problems between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. We'll look at the troubles themselves, which started really in the late 1960s and only ended in the 1990s with the Provisional Irish Republican Army agreeing to turn in their weapons and step back from the terrorist activities that they've been so successful in conducting over the past 30 years. This is a good look at how counterintelligence tradecraft and tactics can be employed in counterterrorism operations. And we'll look at one of the icons of terrorists, and that is Michael Collins, who was a terrorist and then later a politician and later died himself in the Civil War in the early 1920s, attempting to bring peace and unification to Ireland when so many Irish did not want the treaty that he had helped negotiate with the British, which created Ireland and then Northern Ireland, which was primarily Protestant. And so that's our look at practical perspectives on counterterrorism operations. Those courses we teach on how terrorist groups came into being, on how they operate, on the operations that they've conducted over the last, 150 or so years. We hope you'll contact us at ctcitraining.org to schedule some of our courses to assist your employees in being better informed about the terrorism threats that we face today and how they've evolved over the years. Thank you very much for listening.